Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Amy Lindner Lesser. Welcome back to Introspection, Grief to Growth. Today, I'm really excited to have Julie Kick as my guest. Julie is an ICF Accredited life and business coach, author, trainer, keynote speaker. She's known as the systems specialist and can break down just about any concept or a big picture problem into doable steps. Her training topics include personal development, coaching, mentoring skills, leadership skills, and using the Thrive process during life after loss. She's been writing her entire life, but her book, Weathering the Grief Storm, and I had to remember where I put it, there it is her first book. Welcome to Introspection, the podcast about moving from grief to growth. I'm Amy Lindner Lesser, your host. Introspection started out as a podcast about hospitality, innkeeping, and innkeepers. After about a year, I realized that my life and interests have morphed from hospitality to helping others navigate from grief and loss to growth and living. In this new version of Introspection, I will be talking about my personal experiences with loss, and there are quite a few, what I've learned along the way through my professional training, as well as from my coaching experiences. I'll also be bringing in guests to share interesting ideas. So grab a beverage, find a comfy place, take a deep breath, and listen in. In February of 2016, Julie's husband and soulmate, John, lost his battle with cancer. His death and working through the grieving process has taught her the value of each moment and inspired her to share her experience and the lessons she's learned. Julie lives with her and husband Mark in Vancouver, Washington, on the left coast, has 2 grown boys, 3 grown stepchildren, and 2 grandchildren. So, what is her book, Weathering the Grief Storm? Julie, like many of us, never believed that her husband John would die. Told that his stage 4 metastatic melanoma was terminal, they trained their combined focus on beating the odds and on John becoming a medical miracle. Julie blogged about their experiences, planning one day to pen a happy ending. In Weathering the Grief Storm, Julie lays bare the unpredictable twists and turns of her husband's cancer battle and its irrepressible impact on every aspect of their lives, from the devastating diagnosis through debilitating treatments and navigating one emergency after another. Julie shares raw, very private moments with unreserved candor and vivid detail. John dies, but the story doesn't end there. In the wake of this loss, Julie begins a profound journey towards rebirth, prompting her to reflect upon the coping mechanisms that gave her strength, grounded her in the present, and granted her permission to be vulnerable. Thrive was Julie's lifeline through her year-long process of caring for John, losing him, and relearning acts of inescapable singleness, and she knew that it was a method worth sharing. Weathering the Grief Storm is a love story coupled with an empowering survival tool for anyone enduring the unimaginable and wanting their own happy ending. The book meant so much to me, especially when I finished reading it on a plane coming home from visiting my daughter in Florida on Super Bowl weekend. And that's a very poignant timing, and I'm going to let Julie talk about that. But when I read the book, I don't know how many of you are aware, I lost my husband, Steve, to metastatic melanoma also. And so having this was it was like in some ways reading my own life story. And I knew that I had to have Julie on to share with you. So help me welcome Julie. Thank you so much for writing your story and John's story and for sharing it with the rest of you and the rest of us. So, since I alluded to Super Bowl, can you tell us a little bit about why that's so significant?
Absolutely. So John and I were both huge Seattle Seahawks fans. We lived at the time in Walla Walla, Washington, in Eastern Washington. Now I'm in the Vancouver, Washington area, but we are both, he was a big Seattle Seahawks fan, as I am as well, which has been rough the last couple of years and was rough for many years. But at the time that he was, before he died in 2016, the Seahawks were doing pretty well. And we were hoping that they were going to make it to the Super Bowl. And so he kind of had a goal to live, and he was at the end of his cancer journey at that point, to live until the Super Bowl. And he actually died on Super Bowl Sunday at about 11 o'clock in the morning. So didn't quite make it, but it was interesting because we had the game on that evening, that afternoon and evening. And the halftime show that year, they had the whole audience had these placards, and they spelled out something about love. I can't remember the specifics, but people were reaching out to me on Facebook because, Love Trumps Cancer was the name of the blog. And we talked about how, in the end, love won and cancer lost because he was in a, better place, out of pain. And so everyone was reaching out saying, oh my gosh, this is John, sharing his message through the Super Bowl halftime show. So yeah, that was very significant. And Super Bowl's a little challenging for me. And a couple of years ago, Super Bowl Sunday fell on February 7th, which was the anniversary of his death. So that was a pretty challenging day for sure.
I can only imagine. I don't believe grief ever goes away.
Yeah, there is definitely no such thing as life after grief. We just passed the 8th anniversary. And I keep wondering when I'm going to go back to normal, and that's never going to happen. And interestingly, John's birthday was August 7th. So he died exactly on his half birthday, which, there's some, I think, interesting sort of numerology, significance to that.
Yep. And my husband died 2 days before my birthday.
Oh, wow. That's tough.
So I look at it, now that I can do that, it's almost 25 years later, but I look at it as the silver lining is that he knew not to die on my birthday. And it was his last gift.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just a side note, I have a ton of Aquarians in my life. And so John's daughter, my stepdaughter, her birthday is the 1st of February. My son's is the 3rd of February. My nephew's is the 6th of February. And I swear, he just was determined not to mess up anybody's birthday. And so he waited it out, hung on there until the 7th. But it was really important to him, especially for my stepdaughter, his daughter. And we had a beautiful little celebration next to his hospice bed on her birthday. I have a photograph of him sitting there holding his coffee. And I went and got a gift for her from him. And it was a really special day. So.
And I know for me, what we did was 2 days later, I went out to dinner with my mother and my 2 daughters to celebrate my birthday. Because I said, I knew that even though I was supposed to be in mourning, I was also alive. And I knew that I needed to celebrate that I was still alive and that I was going to get through this somehow.
Good for you. That's exactly right.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I alluded to the fact that grief is sort of, at this point, is sort of like in the other room, in the next room with the door closed, very quiet. And then every once in a while, it pushes through the door and goes, boo. And, then all of a sudden there's, a crying jag or a little bit of sadness or something. And it's like, okay, yep, it's there.
A grief storm, hence the name of the book. That's what I call a grief storm. And that's really truly how it feels. It's just like a hurricane blows in. In fact, I wrote a blog post about it one time, and I said it feels a lot like a hurricane. It blows in, you have this huge reaction, and then just like a hurricane, all of a sudden everything gets calm, and you have to kind of deal with the aftermath of what just happened, and process through that. So it's definitely, and it's funny that I got goosebumps when you said just in the next room, because John said that to us so many times the week before he died. Think of it as I'm just in the next room. I'm not really gone. And it's funny to put grief in that category. I actually really like that.
I think it is, because it doesn't ever completely go away. There can be, weeks, sometimes months where at least for me, I can go along and think that my life is normal. What I did learn was that normal after a significant life change is never pre-life change normal.
That's
That
correct. Yep.
everything changes. And you do a wonderful job of talking about losing your identity. And, who were you now? You were not a wife, you were a widow, you not a caregiver anymore. Who are you?
If you have someone who dies of a terminal illness, that is a huge transition.
Yeah. And it's when my mother and stepfather passed, and I was not caregiving like you were. But I was like, oh my God, I have all these hours. What do I do with them?
Well, I mean, also when your spouse dies, and I tell people, because people will say, well, it's not as bad as what you went through. And I always say, don't say that. Grief is grief. And it doesn't matter if you've lost a pet or a marriage or, a career or a person, grief is grief. But I will say, when you lose a spouse, it's a whole other level, I think, of loss, because the day that he died, all of a sudden I realized that every plan I had for my life had died with him, And I remember I wrote about it in the book, but sitting on the bed the night of his memorial with my stepdaughter, who was my rock through the whole thing. And she said to me, Dad would want you to look at this as an adventure, because you can do whatever you want now. Your kids are grown. And I titled that chapter, The Adventure I Never Asked For. Mm-hmm. But it was true. And really, truly, there's a whole other level of, okay, now what do I do when you lose a spouse, I think.
I think you're right. And also I had, and I'm not comparing, but I had the privilege with my mother and stepfather that they weren't living in my house. I could leave them and leave my caregiving, at least, at the door, and then come home to a, normal life.
Right.
When my husband was home and dying, it was a very different thing. I got into bed with grief.
Yeah. Literally.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're still living in the home that you shared with your husband. No, you're not. Okay. I'm not. I mean, they tell you not to make any changes within the first year after going through a large loss like this. And we talked about it before my husband died, because I grew up here in the Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington area. And most of my family and friends are here. I was, singing in a Sweet Adeline's chorus in Portland. And he said, I really think you should move back there, once I'm gone. And I waited less than 6 months because I couldn't be in that house. And I couldn't be in the city, in Walla Walla. Everywhere I went reminded me of him, that it was pervasive. I had my house professionally cleared by a psychic before I sold it, because there was so much just, good energy, but also grief energy in that house. So, I was actually pretty fine with moving on from that.
I think the fact that you thought about it and talked about it beforehand made it a little easier to do that. But for somebody who, and this is going to sound a little strange, hasn't had the luxury of being able to talk about what happens after with the person that they love, then it's much harder to make that decision. So, waiting.
I've had that conversation with several people, the difference between the long goodbye, which is what happens when you have someone who's terminal. Mm-hmm. And it's a brutal process to go through, because you literally watch that person die. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know that I would wish that. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, but you have also the chance to say everything and to, hear everything and all that, versus the sudden somebody gets hit by a Mack truck and they're all of a sudden gone, or has a heart attack and, dies. You don't have that brutal, horrible year and a half or whatever it is of losing them, but also you don't have the, there's things unsaid and there's things you need to know. And I mean, I had the craziest, in the moments after John died, I had the weirdest, dumbest thoughts, like, oh my gosh, do I know where the key to that thing is? Or, I should have asked him what to do when the hot tub does this. Or, I mean, we had this hot tub, and I swear to you, the minute he died, that thing quit working, and it didn't matter what I did. I was so mad at him because he was the hot tub guy, and I didn't know what to do. And, so there was that panic feeling. But I can imagine losing someone instantly, how much more intense that would be. So I don't know. None of it's good. I don't know which is better.
It's 6 of one and half dozen of the other. They're both awful.
Pros and cons each, I guess.
They're both terrible. And, I think in some ways, like a lot of other things in life, we want what we don't have. So that, I would have rathered that my husband didn't suffer and that I didn't suffer through it. However, I'm grateful for the time we had. And, he had a diagnosis, and then they thought they had gotten everything, and it came back 2 years later after we changed careers and moved, and and then it was like, oh God, now would I have wanted him to go quickly? No, because we had 2 wonderful years before he got really sick.
Right.
So yeah, it's never great. You talk about the Thrive method, and I talk about Thrive a lot, not using the exact
acronym.
Well, not as an acronym, but more as the fact that with a large transition, we have the opportunity to redefine our lives as the positive part of that. And, while there's a loss, there's also the freedom to possibly, for the first time ever in our lives, to be the person we really want to be and not have to worry about what did our spouse want us to do, or did we behave this way because our mother told us to behave that way. Now it's, if I wanted to be whatever, a dancer, I could be a dancer. If I wanted to be a singer, I could do that. So talk a little bit about what Thrive means and how it's helped you.
So I am a certified life and business coach. I made a living doing that for many years. I'm also a writer and a trainer. And so when I decided to, after, 3 years, to finally knuckle down and write the book, I knew that I had the blog that I had written. And I'm really glad that I did that as he was, we were going through the process, because it was in real time. And I know that had I written about, what happened when he was diagnosed 3 or 4 years later, it would have been a different experience. So I was really glad I had the blog, but I also knew that I wanted the book to have, because of my background. And so I hired a book coach named Jim House, the book carver. And I went down to San Diego and did a full-on VIP day with him. And, we basically mapped it out. And we mapped it out with the concept of, how can I take my experience and my story and, turn it into a process that helps people move through this. And then eventually, hopefully, and I really would still like to do this. And I was just talking to someone right before you about this, and the concept of, being able to actually speak from the stage as a keynote speaker with the Thrive process, or do a weekend retreat or whatever. I don't think I want to do grief coaching or counseling, but I do like the idea of this process. So the idea is, what did I learn through the course of not only John's cancer, journey and death, but also the aftermath of that for me, which is really, that's the second part of the book, and was the bigger piece, obviously, because then you're thrust into that grieving process. And I have always held the belief, or at least as long as I can remember in my adult life, that everything that happens in my life is there to teach me. And I can proactively, consciously choose to look at everything that happens as, a lesson. What am I taking from this? Because I can't control what happens to me, but I can control my response to it. And so that's kind of the premise that I started with. We mapped out the book. We mapped out the sections. I did not have the Thrive process when I left San Diego, but as I started writing, these themes were emerging, and it kind of gave birth to itself. And I love the fact that acronym is so, spot on for what happens. And the tagline for the book is learning to thrive within grief. And I thought initially the word was through grief, but then we talked about it and I said, it isn't, because you don't get through it. Like we said earlier, you're inside of it. And so how do you thrive within that? And so the acronym, and I always use notes just because I don't want to mess it up. But I do, believe me, I made it up and I know what it is. I'm always looking at, so you'll see my eyes go over there. So T stands for trust yourself. And there's a section in the book that talks through each one of these things. But the idea is that there is no right or wrong way to grieve, even though you'll hear, that from people all the time. People will think, I started dating fairly within about 4 or 5 months after John died. And we talked about that before he died. And there were people who had a lot to say to me about that and just really felt like it was wrong. And, and I knew for me what was right for me. And, so there are other areas as well as a person who's suffering from loss, but learning to really go within and trust yourself and listen to yourself and your intuition is huge. H stands for honor your feelings. And that really has to do with, as you never know how you're going to feel, especially in the first 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 months of grieving. You could feel 50 different feelings in the first hour of your day. And what I've learned as I went through it was pushing against those, or feeling like I shouldn't be feeling that way, or trying to feel a different way never worked for me. So really honoring your feelings and accepting that where you are is where you are. R stands for remain present. That's also a big one, because as when you suffer a loss, you have a really strong tendency, or I did, to do the what about game. If only I had, if we just gotten him to National Institutes of Health sooner and gotten him into a trial, or, could I have done this differently living in the past, or worrying about what am I going to do now? What happens if I this or that, or so really remaining present and staying in the now as much as possible was very helpful for me. Invest in yourself is the I of thrive. And for me, that wasn't monetarily necessarily, although it could be, but for me, that was taking advantage of the hospice counseling and resources that were offered to me, the grief support groups that I found, the books that people recommended that I went and got and read. I always say that, I dove into grief head first because I wanted to get through the worst of it as quickly as I could. And so I kind of approached it, like a coach. But really I did invest, and also it's a time thing. I invested, somebody told me about a month after John died, your job is really to grieve right now, and I was an entrepreneur and I had to keep working. Unfortunately, we didn't have life insurance because he was pretty young when he got sick, and it was on my list that I had never gotten around to. So get life insurance if you're married or in partnership with anybody. But I had to keep working, and I was at a business conference and I was struggling. And the guy running the conference, I said, well, my husband died, in February. He's like, wait, this February, like a month ago? And I said, yeah. And he goes, oh, you're not going to probably be making a lot of plans for the future at the moment. You're going to have to really take the time. And if you wake up and you can't work, you got to honor that. And so really allowing yourself to be where you need to be, and investing the time and energy into that, I think is important. V stands for vow to act, which for me was, listening to myself in the moment, as I've said, and if an action felt right, taking that. So for instance, selling my house and moving, when everyone was saying, you're not supposed to make any changes in the first 6 months. Well, you know what? I knew what was best for my mental health, my emotional health, and my life. And so I sort of bucked the trend and did that. And, I met my second husband, who John told me he was going to send me. The week before he died, he said, I'm going to send you the perfect person. And of course, in the moment, I just was like, la, 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 I don't want to hear this. But he did. And so I repartnered within a year, which he also said, you're a partnership person. You're going to repartner. People are going to think it's too soon. Screw them. Who cares what they think? It's